do what you need to do because we are going to get started. My name is Jason Reed. Hello and welcome to another expert web panel brought to you by Inclusion Speakers, your partner in DEIB presentations and training. Today, we are going to be talking about accessible and inclusive communications. Now, as always, we've tackled a big topic here. We only have half an hour, but we plan to give you some insights and takeaways that will help you communicate within your organization in a more accessible way. Now, before we get to it, I'd just like to acknowledge that our broadcast is originating on Treaty 13 land, traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, Wendake, and other Indigenous communities. So many of you already know me. My name is Jason Reed. I'm the head of Inclusion Speakers. I've been speaking about invisible disability now for more than a decade, really. Before that, I was in television, had a career in television news as a producer and a manager, all while dealing with two invisible disabilities, which are Crohn's disease and arthritis. Today, I'm excited to be joined by two esteemed experts. So to my right is Denis Boudreau, who is a longtime trainer, coach, and consultant who specializes in helping organizations create truly inclusive digital experiences for everyone. In fact, he has spoken to audiences around the world about inclusive communication. And he is also the author of one of my favorite books and one I use constantly called The Inclusive Speaker. So I'm going to put a link to where you can get a copy of that book in the follow-up email that I'm going to be sending out today. Also note there's an audio version of that book being produced right now that will soon be on its way to Audible. Glad to have you here, Denis.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we also are really excited to have Ingrid Palmer, our other esteemed expert. So Ingrid was diagnosed with two rare disorders in her teens: retinitis pigmentosa, which causes blindness, and PCOS, which resulted in her growing facial hair. Now, as a Black female who experienced adverse childhood trauma and several years in foster care, Ingrid has overcome adversity directly linked to intersections of race, gender, ability, socioeconomic status, and perceived orientation. Ingrid founded Focus on Ability to combat ableism, challenge bias, and promote universal belonging. So welcome, Ingrid. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Jason. I'm really glad to be here.
And we are hoping to have at least 5, hopefully maybe 10 minutes at the end for your questions, because we know that you want to participate as well, and we'd love to have you do that. In addition, as our conversation progresses, feel free to put your comments in the chat as well as any of your questions. So for the first part of the webinar, I'd like to talk specifically about accessible presentations in meetings, and then we'll move to sort of more general office communications. So, Denis, why don't we start with you? When people think of accessible presentations in meetings, they may think of things like, the font size in their slides or subtitles in videos. But when we talk about people with disabilities, we're talking about more than just people with visual and hearing impairments, correct?
Correct. Absolutely. So, we can sort of start that conversation by recognizing that disabilities range in incredible ways. So when you talk about things like providing alt text for images or captions for videos, we're talking very specifically about typically people who have a visual disability or a hearing disability, for instance. But when you're in a setting for a presentation, for instance, you might very well have someone struggling with other types of challenges, or the environment in which the event is taking place might create barriers for other types of people. And some of these things might be as simple, say, as someone having a learning disability and trying to read what's on the slides that are being presented while someone is talking, and having to deal with both influxes of information coming towards them and not being able to do that, or too many content, or too much content on the screen, and making it impossible for the person to be able to focus on what the presenter is saying, for instance. Or it might be someone like myself. So I'm colorblind. So if the slides present information being presented through the use of color, and that's how you associate pieces of information together, someone like me can very easily miss the point, and not be able to fully appreciate or understand what is being conveyed through that information. It might be, in the case of someone on the autism spectrum, for instance, one of the typical traits that we recognize through research that seems to be common across people who are on the spectrum would be that, colors that are too brightly contrasted, that are too stark, will be triggering for them. So for someone like me, I mean, I would want to have better contrast, but if those contrasts become too big at some point, for some people it might also become an issue. So there's a lot of things like that that you can sort of think about. And then when it comes to just being able to like absorb the information, consume the information that is being shared with you, for a lot of people, being able to process this as it happens might also be problematic or challenging. Therefore, another best practice would be to say, if you are going to, present from a slide deck, for instance, being able to present or share that slide deck ahead of time so that people can actually learn and what you're going to be talking about, either to, wrap their head around it, or just be able to prepare better questions so that they can follow up after you've shared your information. Those are just a couple of examples that we could think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because really, when you think of it, accessible communication starts before, in some ways, the presentation happens. Just getting your audience in there and getting them prepared. So, on a corporate level, it's interesting because this automatically made me think of one of my own stories. But when I was in an organization, one of my biggest regrets was not taking this leadership and management training that was offered from this very prestigious university. And this is many years ago when, standing up for or even identifying yourself as somebody with needs was not something that most people did. So it was this intensive leadership course, and it was over 2 days at this prestigious university. And I found a way to not go, even though I should have, and it probably would have done a lot better for my career. And the reason I didn't was because of my invisible disabilities. I didn't know if there would be things that I would be able to eat there because I had a restricted diet. I knew the days would be long. Like, would my body be able to handle it? Would there be enough breaks? Would there be enough bathroom breaks? Would I be able to get up? Would I be able to walk around? So just, not giving people that information up front so that they can, know what's coming and adjust to that can in itself be a huge barrier.
It can absolutely be, and you're very right. I mean, the delivery of the presentation itself, and preparing the materials that will be used in that presentation are certainly very important aspects. But everything about communicating to the inclusivity of the event prior to the event happening is extremely important for the reasons you mentioned. It's like I've seen many people feel the same way that you do, where not being clear about whether they would be able to fully appreciate the event, or something as simple as not being sure whether the event will be wheelchair accessible, for instance. And maybe knowing that you can get to the venue easily, that you can get to the building easily, but not knowing whether bathrooms will be available to you on the same floor that you are, or if you might have to not be able to go to the restroom. If you need to do that. Like, all these little questions or doubts eventually add up, and then they cause some people to just isolate themselves and not participate when they could, if only we had communicated those things prior to those events.
Yeah, and
That's exactly it. Sorry,
I
I
was
was
going to
just
say,
gonna
Ingrid, what are your
add on to
experiences? Yeah.
this. Yeah, that is exactly what the experiences that you both brought up are so prominent, especially you, Jason, with knowing that people will exclude themselves from attending an event because of not knowing whether or not it will actually be doable for them. And so, like you said, Denis, being able to communicate what's available and the variety and diversity of choices or accommodations for people is really important for um, event organizers and presenters to make clear so that people are not, checking themselves out and not giving the event a chance when they could if the proper accommodations are in place. And that's also why it's really important to always have a diversity of choice to accommodate food necessities, like you indicated, Jason, but also to create an environment where people feel comfortable to give themselves what they need and able to participate. Because, like what you said, Jason, if you don't know if you're able to accommodate your own needs, then you're not going to go because you don't feel comfortable. But the more that we, as a larger community, make it comfortable for people to have what they need in order to fully participate, then that won't happen. So if people know that if I need to stand, I can. If I need to sit while others are standing, that's okay. Then people will feel more comfortable in participating in events and not feel shy or stigmatized by having needs that might not usually fit the norm.
And I mean, as an example, Ingrid, I know you've been legally blind for 30 years. So for yourself, what are examples of some of the things that you like to have or are a must-have for you?
Thank you so much, Jason. And just continuing on with the conversation about pre planning, even something as simple as the layout of the event, or where the room is being event. So, how tables are set up and how chairs are set up can be a real barrier for many people. And we're not just talking about folks that are using mobility devices such as wheelchairs or walkers, but even with myself using a cane and often having a sighted guide with me, I definitely have found that navigating the space where presentations are held can be extremely difficult because of how the setup is, with the tables being very close and not leaving perhaps like areas to walk in between, can really be a barrier for some people depending on what your needs are. Another barrier that I have found in attending presentations, which came up a bit earlier, is Denis talked about this when you're using visuals. So there are a lot of things that come into play when it comes to visuals. Color contrast is one thing, particularly for people with low vision but are still using their usable sight. Having that contrast can be very important, but also including descriptions in your presentation. I attended a very interesting presentation once that included a lot of adventure and a lot of really great storytelling that was accompanied by videos and pictures. So when the presenter stopped speaking and then just had a slideshow or had this video going with background music, I was completely now left out of the presentation because there was no description given of the pictures that were being shown. And when the video was being played, which was also a video of, with no audio except for the background music, I was completely left out of what was being shown. And so it's so important for presenters to start automatically building into their presentations descriptions of what they're showing on a screen. And also when you make movements, I've heard presenters say things like, and I went like this. And I'm left with
Yeah.
like what? What'd you do? And everyone's laughing and having a good time, because something, maybe funny was indicated, but I'm left out because you can still say, I did this, I moved my arms this way, and that would have kept
Yeah.
me in on it. And so it's just these little simple adjustments that can really make the difference from someone being able to stay strongly in tuned with what's being shared or being left out and having a gap there.
Yeah, and if I may add, for comedy effects and gravitas, for instance, when you actually describe what you're doing from a stage presence standpoint, you're also emphasizing on what you're talking about, so you add to it. People feel it more when you think about presenting from the perspective of supporting someone with sight loss, for instance. Just thinking about how you describe your slides, for instance, or the visual that you might be using, if you were thinking about, let me describe this in a way so that if I was talking to someone on the phone, or in a podcast episode, and it's only our audio, would they still be able to understand what I'm talking about, or would they lose some of it? And
Yes.
just thinking about that would have you think differently about how to present or describe what you're presenting. And the same general idea, if you're planning on putting together a video in your presentation, and you listen to it with your eyes closed, and you're only listening to what you're hearing, are you realizing that you might be missing something important? And if so, consider adding audio description to your video, or at least like do a live audio description of what's going on so that you can support visually, through voice, what is happening visually on the video itself. And that makes a huge difference again.
Absolutely. And when we open ourselves to just being creative about how we present our materials, there's just so much variety that can come out of it. And sometimes we think, oh, that might actually take away from what we're doing or presenting. But the truth is that whenever inclusion is increased, it's just better off for everyone, even those without disabilities always benefit when inclusivity is increased. So it's always a win, never a drawback.
Absolutely. So, if we transition maybe then to from, meetings and presentations to general sort of office communication and maybe some of the digital tools we use, Denis, what would sort of be your sort of top tips or advice when it comes to that communicating in the office?
Well, a lot of the same things apply, right? I mean, if you transpose someone being on a stage doing a presentation to someone being in front of a meeting room presenting to their peers about, the financial results of the last quarter or this or that, I mean, it's still presentation. So from that standpoint, everything applies, right? I mean, you still want to make sure that from like a vision, auditory standpoint, cognitive standpoint, people can actually grasp what you're talking about and be fully involved and included in what's going on. If we're talking about communication from the perspective of communicating to your workforce about a policy, for instance, or about anything that's happening in the business, you want to acknowledge that people learn in different ways, and people aggregate information in different ways. So if the only method of communication is through email, it may not work for everybody. If you're thinking, oh, we're going to do something great, we're going to send a video, and that's what we're going to be, and that's how we're going to be sharing that information, and that video is not accessible because it doesn't have synchronized captions, or it doesn't have a text transcript, or any of those things, again, you're going to leave people out. If you're thinking about sending a PDF out as a way to communicate the information, but the PDF is not accessible to people, again, some people will not be able to use it. So a very basic consideration is to have alternate formats. So regardless of how you're going to share the information, think about other options. Maybe it's an audio version of your text file, maybe it's a video, maybe it's this or that, but like putting different formats in conjunction will allow more people to actually really get the information that's there. You want to make sure that your events, your meetings, your communications in general are also accessible. Meaning that, for instance, when we use a platform like Zoom for a virtual meeting, we know that the platform tends to do better from an accessibility standpoint than other platforms, which I will not name right now, but everybody knows. And
Yes.
and different features that are available to people should they choose to use that. So that's great from like a virtual standpoint. But if you're going to have a meeting, if you're having this annual meeting where all of your workforce is invited to, thinking about sign language interpreters, if that's something that you've identified as a need internally, making sure that you have live transcripts, not just the regular AI generated captions that are good but never good enough, but really having an actual human transcribing as things are going so that we can get as close to perfection as possible, are examples of how you might want to create more inclusion, or actually put more thought into being more inclusive. It might, again, you can think about things like color contrast. You can think about the use of color to convey information. All those things are going to be, of course, important. But I think one of the most important things for me, and I'm going to stop with that one because I could go on for days, but I mean, the one thing that I feel is really important is actually having a conversation with your workforce to try and build an environment of trust where people actually feel like they want to disclose what their challenges or needs might be so that you can better address them. Most people in workplaces just don't feel safe enough to disclose those things because they're afraid to what Ingrid said earlier. They're afraid of maybe of stigma or being discriminated against or this or that, being seen as less than, and therefore they're going to keep that for themselves. But then as they go through every, their work days, they struggle because the environment is not adapted to their reality or their needs. If we have these conversations where we can build this environment where people feel safe, then we understand and we get to know them better, and we can better serve them in ways that actually work for them. And everybody benefits from that. The entire organization can thrive more because everyone can contribute to the full extent of their potential.
Absolutely. And just one small thing with that, too, you mentioned having the sign language interpreter. I found that when I did presentations that had sign language interpreters, my performance improved because I was made more aware. I didn't go as quickly. I used pauses for effect. I made sure I enunciated things better. And I think it just goes to show that accommodations work for everybody. So, and speaking of everybody, we'd love to get to your questions. Before we do, Ingrid, is there anything so far, and again, I know this is in some ways a superficial but important conversation. Is there anything we've missed? Is there one key that you would have to a more inclusively communicative organization?
Denis did a really great job. What I would add, when Denis was talking about the importance of having conversations, when we're talking about smaller groups, like in smaller teams in the workplace, it's really great to have those conversations about what specific things a person can need or you can do. For instance, when a lot of organizations have files on something like SharePoint. But when somebody is like visually impaired or using a screen reader where we can't jump to things, we have to like read through everything. When you can learn that about a person and send that link directly to them instead of just saying, hey, why don't you access this through SharePoint? Like those little things can make like a big difference when you get to know your individual teammates better. And then that will translate out when you're having bigger meetings. Your team will communicate to the larger organization what could be helpful during those larger meetings. For myself, for instance, when I'm having a meeting, and this has become a thing that we do a lot for visually impaired and low vision people, is to do the visual descriptions. I'm going to be honest and tell you, I hate them. They take up a lot of time. I'm not interested in what you're wearing, and I forget as soon as you finish telling me. As soon as a person says, I have short hair, I wear glasses, and I have on a shirt with stripes with these colors, and the next person goes, I can't keep that in my head. I have no idea. What's more important to me than a visual description of yourself is that you say your name before you speak so I can associate what's being said to that person since I can't see you. So getting to know an individual person and what they like, and I want to say that that's me. Somebody else might really want those visual descriptions, but unless you're wearing something exciting, I can do without them. So getting to know each individual person and actually what they would like is really important as well.
Yeah, and everything you said there, Ingrid, about getting to know your employees is just, it's good management. It's good leadership. It's things that we should be doing naturally anyways. So it just shows you even more of the power that we have when it comes to sort of building relationships
Yes.
and how we can do that in the workplace. So we don't have any questions yet. So what I'll do for the time being here, and I'm aware we got about 5 minutes left, is I want to quickly go through our diversity calendar. So we got a whole bunch of stuff coming up. Let's start with 2 days from now. We've got American Disability Act Day, Women's Equality Day in August. In September, we have both Deaf Awareness Month and World Suicide Prevention Month. And October gets really busy for some of us. In the neurodiversity realm, we have Learning Disabilities Awareness Month, ADHD Awareness Month, Mental Health Awareness Week and Day, and also a couple of areas where I'm usually fairly busy, which is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which you call DEEM, and Invisible Disabilities Week. So for those of you looking for a speaker on almost any area of inclusion, please check out our website at inclusionspeakers.com. We specialize in working with organizations and their employee resource groups, and we make booking a great speaker easy. And we have a question from Zoe. How can employees influence their leaders to start supporting disabilities without having to disclose theirs or others' disabilities? For example, somebody in IT, marketing, or finance. So how
So
can
how can
go ahead?
so how can
I
the
was going.
employees help their leaders better understand is the question,
Yes.
right? Okay. Were you going first, Ingrid?
Oh, well, I was going to suggest with that that using your organization's feedback opportunities is a really good opportunity to make suggestions about what you'd like to see more. So a lot of times, we don't take the time to fill out those surveys or to do those check-in and diversity surveys that our organizations do, but those are really good opportunities to make suggestions on the type of training that you want to see, on the type of things that are going on in your organizations that need change. And that's another opportunity in order to get those changes brought into your organization without disclosing what your disability is.
Great idea.
Yeah, I would add that it might be difficult for someone to disclose. So that person coming forward and saying something about a need might not be something that they want to do. But those of us who don't have that need, for instance, can absolutely be allies of the persons who do. And having someone take advantage of their privilege, whatever that privilege might be, to speak up and ask for something that they've observed is lacking in the organization in terms of communication, can be a way to sort of open that pathway for those conversations to happen. If you know, for instance, that one of your colleagues, you know, has that disability, because they confide it into you, and you're aware of those things, and of course, as long as they're comfortable with you, you know, bringing that up for whatever reason, then someone who doesn't, like, if someone, like, let's say a friend of mine was not colorblind and noticed things about issues with color blindness, and they brought it up. If I was not comfortable saying these things, I would appreciate someone else bringing it up, so that at some point I might feel comfortable enough to bring that up myself. If I have a one-on-one with my manager, for instance, after a while I might build the courage or the confidence or the trust to bring that up. And if those conversations have happened from other people as well, who use their privilege, their status, their authority to speak to those things, then it creates this environment where slowly but progressively, but and slowly, we can start having those conversations without feeling like it's taboo one way or another. So it's not just
This
those who
is
actually have the needs who should speak up. It's also those who don't have those needs but want to support, who can speak on those questions as well to help open that path for others.
This is where it
Sorry.
also goes back to leadership. If leadership would be willing to be more open about their needs and be willing to speak themselves about accommodation needs and to share examples um, of when they needed help or accommodations that they have had to use in the past or currently use, that would go a long way into creating that environment where employees would also feel comfortable. So it's really important that leadership show vulnerability and lead by example in this area.
Very true.
Totally agree. So we've hit 1 o'clock. So I know some of you have to go, and thank you for joining us. There will be a follow up email. And if any of you missed the first part, there is going to be a replay window. We do still have a couple of other questions. So if you have the time and you want to stay on the call, we're going to get to those questions now. And for those who have to leave us, thanks for joining us. All right. First thing I wanted to ask was, Kevin, I think there's a great question in there. I'm just not quite clear. If you were able to rephrase that, I think there might be a typo or two in there. So I'm not entirely understanding your question, but I'd love to address it. Emmy, this may sound too specific, but I know, Denis, you'll probably have the answer for this. But regarding color contrast, how do we know what is enough and too much, considering both needs for contrast, and also not wanting to trigger people? Is there like a website or something we can go to, or a tool?
Yeah, there's a lot of resources. If you so first of all, measuring color contrast, is based on algorithms that will determine the luminosity ratio between your foreground and background colors. So nobody does that manually. There's a bunch of tools out there that you can Google for color contrast checkers. They will ask for the color value of your text and the background the text is against. You run both of those together, and the tool will tell you whether it passes or it doesn't pass. I'm going to avoid all the technical aspects of the accessibility standards that speak to that, but just know that there's a tool. As long as you can get the RGB, the CMYK, or the Xcode value of the colors that you're using, it will tell you whether it passes or fails. So in terms of getting to a certain threshold that should work theoretically for people, that's the way to do it. Now the reality is, as Ingrid mentioned, for in another aspect, everybody's different. So there are color contrasts that drastically fail those thresholds that I can still see personally that others would not see, and there are colors that pass that are still hard for me to perceive. So everyone's different when it comes to that, but through research years ago, there was a threshold determined, and that's what we work with. In terms of having too much of a contrast, there aren't any standards or guidelines out there that are officially recognized, but there is an understanding or an agreement in the design community, for instance, that you want to avoid like white text on on a black background or black text on a white background because the contrast is too strong. So designers tend to sort of like make that a little less of a contrast by using like a dark gray text on a white background or a light gray background. Like they'll mitigate that a little bit so that it's not completely drastic in terms of contrast. But there aren't, in the same way that you have these measurements that you can check for sufficient contrast, there are no such guidelines for too much contrast. It's more about avoiding really like very obvious combinations that might be a little might cause a little too much eye strain or be just too strong.
Okay.
We can't, yeah, we're never going to get things perfect all the time, but I think if it depends on what you're planning for. If it's a presentation that's coming up, I would have something in the registration for that event that asks people what their needs are. And then perhaps, as Denis mentioned, those things can be sent out in advance in the way that people need it. And if it's at a live event, offering different choices for people or having different avenues for people to engage, whether you're going to have two different screens and one has this one, you can indicate that this one is for people who are low or low vision, and this one could be for this screen for people who are neurodiverse, something like that. But thinking out of the box on how we can provide accommodation, that definitely goes a long way. We are not perfect beings. We strive to do the best that we can, and that's absolutely what we encourage. Is having that
Yeah, one of
Yeah.
communication.
Oh, it
oh,
looks like we lost Ingrid for the moment. We have
so
some fun.
while you try to bring her back, I'm just going to add real quick. One of my absolute favorite tips or techniques to measure color contrast from a non-technical standpoint is just to run a grayscale filter on my content and see whether there's any information there that I can no longer really perceive properly because the colors are no longer present in the message being conveyed. And it's amazing what you notice. I mean, you look at something and you're like, this is great, and then you turn everything into grayscale and you realize, oh, I can no longer determine this against that, and therefore it's a really good indication that there might be a problem for accessibility.
Awesome. So I want to be respectful of other people's time, but I do want to get to Kevin's question. It's a great one. So he asked, what options are there for people with severe speech impairments and other people with more severe disabilities to participate in meetings? I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
My
What I have
first
seen.
thought. Oh, go ahead, Ingrid. Yeah.
When I have participated in meetings with others, I've seen a couple things. I've seen where a person has an interpreter with them and can have somebody then to interpret what they're saying if they have difficulty. And I've also seen where people have used written text. Um, but that's not always like necessary. Sometimes um, the person has been understood when they think perhaps that they won't. And I think that that comes also to when we're changing our culture and we're making it comfortable for others to be who they are and to communicate in the ways that they can. And when we show patience and inclusivity, that just makes a better environment for everyone. So it depends on actually, I would say, what that person is most comfortable with.
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead,
was going to
Denise.
say, yeah, I was going to say if someone can type in their questions and someone else reads them out loud, that might be a way to do that. I've seen people who were nonverbal or had speech challenges actually use text to speech to have a piece of technology say what they wrote prior to launching the question, so to speak. So that's another way to work around that challenge. But the interpreter is a good idea as well if that's what the person has as a method of communicating. Like all these things are very valid.
Hmm.
Wow, this has been a lot of great information in 40 minutes. So I really appreciate having you both on here, Denis and Ingrid. And as I mentioned, I'll be sending a follow up email where you can learn a little bit more about Denis and Ingrid, and also check out Denis' book as well. For those of you who participated, for those of you who asked questions, for everybody on the call, thank you very much for joining us. If this is a topic you're interested in and you want to bring the topic to your organization, just let us know here at Inclusion Speakers, or check out our website. We've got a list of our speakers, a list of our topics. So we always look forward to hearing from you and getting your feedback. So thank you very much, and have a